Okay, I'm getting a signal which I assume means that we're ready to go. So buckle your seatbelts. Thank you very much for being here this morning. It is a pleasure to be seeing you, and it is an honor to be coming as a panel after Obi Ezekwesili. It was very inspiring to hear the stories of the gap between the theory and the practice of democracy, and the reaffirmation that one important way to fill that gap is with the engagement of people. This panel is about civil society and executive overreach. And here, when we talk about civil society, we often think that civil society are NGOs or organizations, but civil society is all of us. It is the citizenry as it acts in a government and under certain circumstances. So I have the honor of being joined at this panel by Mische, Associate Professor of Sociology and Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, Eva Kulik-Bielinska, Executive Director of the Stefan Batory Foundation, Aidan Eyakuze, Chief Executive Officer of the Open Government Partnership, and Michael Bernhard, Ehrlich Professor of Political Science at the University of Florida. And without further introductions or loss of time, we will start this panel because we know that there is a fierce timekeeper who I'm not seeing, but I know that that is going to happen. So I want to make the best out of our time. So we will start with Michael. Thank you very much, Michael.
So I want to thank our friends and colleagues at Notre Dame for two things: for organizing such a wonderful event and for their generosity in hosting this and accommodating all of us. I think we all really appreciate what you've done here. So I'm going to begin a kind of general talk about civil society and the problem of executive aggrandizement. So most of us in political science think of democracy as a self-enforcing system of power. Actors hold each other to the rules of democracy through built-in accountability mechanisms. They do this through veto points that we've talked about, institutional veto points, but also on imposing costs on opponents for their bad behavior when they break the rules of democracy. Executive aggrandizement tries to upset this by releasing executive power from the constraints of accountability. We all know that there are multiple forms of accountability. The three that we talk about most often are vertical accountability provided by elections, and we know that's how we throw the bums out of power, through party competition. Horizontal accountability, which is provided by the separation of powers in parliamentary systems. It's also provided by coalition governments. And by the policing of the executive by the judiciary, the legislative, the civil service exercising its rule under law. One that we talk about less is social accountability. And social accountability, the main actor providing that is civil society. Civil society's main roles in the maintenance of democracy are monitoring the government and publicizing breaches of the rule of law, contesting breaches in the legal system by taking issues to courts, and finally, contentious protest politics, which imposes audience costs on those ruling, hurts their popularity, creates a sense of grievance in anticipation of the next round of elections. Most aspiring dictators tend to go after horizontal and vertical accountability first, inasmuch as they and inasmuch as it persists, civil society can play an important support role in supporting others in resisting executive overreach. So when the executive goes after horizontal mechanisms of accountability, civil society can be supportive there. Civil society can also fight to maintain vertical accountability as well. In time, however, most aggrandizing executives turn to trying to constrain civil society. And there are several well-known measures that aspirational dictators use to weaken social accountability. The first, which has received a lot of attention lately, is shrinking public space, that is, controlling and attacking of the media, and tougher registration of organizations, making it harder for civil society organizations to exist legally and to exercise their constraints. Aggrandizing executives also use state resources to bolster supporting organizations, to subsidize organizations that support them politically, and to withdraw funding from groups that oppose them. A third tactic is active disinformation about oppositional civil society. We see the flooding of the public sphere with falsehoods, rumors, conspiracies, and diversions. Fourth, we see the harassing and arresting of activists. We see things like detention without cause, bogus politicized investigations and audits, and at the harshest edge, arrest and imprisonment. A fifth, authoritarian regimes also try to displace authentic civil society organizations and mobilizations with their own movements, sometimes called NGOs, government-organized GMOs, and staging their own demonstrations in support of their policies or counter-demonstrating civil society contentious activity. Sixth, one of the most effective repressive measures has been so-called foreign agent laws, which discriminate against organizations that take funds from foreign aid programs, especially those connected to human rights and rule of law. Such organizations are singled out and stigmatized as foreign agents and subject to stricter reporting requirements and are uncomfortably monitored by the police. This was introduced most effectively by Russia in 2012, and as all things repressive in Russia, it was quickly copied by Belarus. Orban's Hungary tried to introduce something similar in 2017, but it was rescinded because it violated EU law. A replacement law was then followed up that continues to allow them to obtrusively monitor and investigate NGOs and CSOs. And more recently, the Georgian and Kyrgyz regimes have put such a law into practice. I would argue that the current age of democratic backsliding has changed what's at stake in terms of civil society's role in politics. I believe that we've entered an age where the dominant cleavage of politics have shifted. We've moved to an age where we no longer fight over policy, but we fight over a regime cleavage between the maintenance of liberal democracy versus the introduction of populist competitive authoritarianism. With this, civil society becomes a zone of intense contestation between groups supporting populism and those supporting liberalism. This has been described as the pillarization of civil society. Distinct sectors of civil society has become constituencies for competing political parties, and they have distinct political cultures and sources of information. So we no longer have one civil society, we have contesting civil societies that are arrayed on both sides of this regime question, which has become so central to our politics these days. When the other side is in power, these distinct civil societies will attempt to undermine the opponent, and when their side is in power, they'll be supportive of the rulers. As the regime question has moved to the forefront, civil society has been weaponized in the party political struggle for power. In my work, I've called the liberal side of trying to protect democracy firewall civil society, when it challenges authoritarianism as insurgent civil society. The civil society organizations helping to keep aspiring autocrats in power or directly undermine Democrats in power I refer to as authoritarian civil society. So if I'm right, the problem of defeating executive aggrandizement involves more than just simply throwing the rascals out of power once, which is what we have described as the successes of the struggle for democracy so far. There are several prominent examples where alliances between political parties and civil society organizations mobilize the electorate to defeat populists in power from below. The earliest case of this was the removal of Vladimir Mečiar in Slovakia in 1998, then Robert Fico in Slovakia in 2018, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil in 2023, Andrej Babiš in Czechia in 2021, and peace, that is law and justice in Poland twice in 2007 and 2023. And there's also been one very interesting case where civil society and horizontal accountability worked. That was the recent case of Korea in the recent attempts of Yoon Suk-yeol to declare martial law, and that was resisted by protest and oppositional parties. But the case of those who returned to power, such as Peace or Fico, is very interesting. So when removed, the possibility of a return to power by former aspiring dictators is real. In that sense, where the main division in our party systems becomes over regime and not over policy, just defeating these parties once doesn't mean they go away. In that sense, populism has become embedded in our party systems and is here for us to stay and to continue to contend with. So the presidential elections this Sunday in Poland are coming close, and Trzaskowski's lead over Nawrocki, this is the Platforma candidate versus the Peace candidate, is narrowing. And so if Trzaskowski is elected, it's quite possible that this will help to further sort of depopularize the bureaucracy and politics in Poland, but it's very close, and Peace remains a viable candidate despite being a viable political party, despite being defeated twice. Babiš may win the next general election in Czechia in return. Bolsonaro has been banned for politics for 8 years, as we learned yesterday in our keynote. But I recently read that his party hopes that pressure from the Trump administration will allow him to run again as they try and put pressure on Brazil to release the ban on him. The moral of this all is that throwing an aggrandizing executive out of power does not solve the problem of executive aggrandizement. If the main axis in many party systems has become populists versus liberals, liberals must find a way to solve the issues that make the populist playbook attractive. If not, we have a persistent problem. Without addressing general dissatisfaction with levels of representation, throwing populists out of power leaves open the possibility of populist returns to power, and with that, a persistent threat to democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And you have well laid out some of the most common tools that governments use to constrain civil society, to limit the work of civil society, and to undermine the capacity of civil society to organize and to engage and to play this role of social accountability. Stephen Levitsky tells us how democracies die. But he also talks about how autocracies can die. And in his newest book, he makes a whole argument about the fact that autocracies are also fragile, that they are not what we see in their most complete expression everywhere, and that there is space to push back. I will now hand over to Aidan. And Aidan, you can come to the podium or remain where you are. This is your party.
Oh, thank you.
And let us hear us a little bit about the Tanzanian story.
Thank you. Good morning. I think I'll sit here next to the security of Michael's analysis. And at the end of, I want to tell you some stories. And at the end of which, you can vote whether I was a firewall civil society or an insurgent civil society. Right? I was listening. So I'm from Tanzania. Tanzania is on the coast of East Africa. It's a fairly large country. It's larger than Nigeria. Oh, she's gone. I was going to poke her. Larger than Nigeria in size, but population, we're a fraction of Nigeria's population. And a country which is known for being peaceful and welcoming and great safaris and Mufasa and everything else. But I was engaged in civil society in Tanzania, and for 10 years I led an organization called Twaweza. Twaweza roughly translates to Yes We Can. And it was about really three things. Amplifying the voices of citizens so that they can inform public policy, enhancing and supporting the agency of citizens so that they can get involved in not just contributing to policy, but in policy implementation, especially in solving their particular problems at a local level, at village and city level. And the third one was really focusing on outcomes. It's not good enough for governments to say, we shall do this, that, and the next thing. We have invested in this, we have budgeted for that, but to actually hold them to account and say, actually, are children learning? Is there medicine in the hospitals? Are there health workers to look after sick people? So those were the main things that we were aiming to do. But I want to tell you some stories about how we engaged in that and how between 2015 and 2021, we ran up against some headwinds from government as we tried to amplify citizens' voices and engage in greater accountability. One of the things Troweza pioneered in 2013 is a public opinion polling platform using mobile phones. And we would create panels of 2,000 to 3,000 citizens. We would offer them a phone so that we could reach them whenever we needed to, and then we would call them and ask them all sorts of questions, mostly focusing on health, education, and water services, but also a whole bunch of other things, including, and this is where we started getting into trouble, their thinking and their evaluation and their assessment of the political leaders. The local councillor, the member of parliament, and, sacrilegious, the president. So we did this in 2013, and for the first few years, it was quite uneventful. 2013, 14, 15, when I joined Troweza, we would poll every year and publish in July what Tanzanians thought of their presidents and parliamentarians, etc. And in the previous governments, President Mkapa, President Kikwete, the approval ratings were really quite high. I told you Tanzanians were generous. They were upwards of 80% consistently. Wow. In 2015, it was election year, very highly contested election year. We polled citizens to see who they would potentially vote for between two contending parties, the ruling party CCM and the powerful opposition party called Chadema. And Chadema had just embraced as its presidential candidate somebody whom CCM had just kicked out. So he crossed the aisle. And it was very competitive, at least in the public discourse. So we polled Tanzanians and asked them, who are you most likely to vote for? And the answers came out this way: 65% for the ruling party candidate and 25% for Chadema. The opposition candidates were very annoyed with me and with Troweza, very. I was actually quite frightened when, on the day after we had announced this polling, I went out to the newspaper stands, and everybody gathers around and talks about what's in the news. And all of the newspapers had my photo on the front page, saying that I've said what I've said. And it was actually a bit frightening. So I sort of backed away from that before they could recognize me, and drove and went to back home. But cut a long story short, 2015, the president did indeed win. But not with a much reduced majority. It was about 57% to 45%. The next year, he was doing his populist things, showing up and in person at Ministry of Finance and saying, where are all these people? How come the desks are empty? Showing up at hospitals, and why are people sleeping on the floor? Where are the mattresses, etc. Very visible engagement with citizens' issues. So we polled, of course, in 2016, and his approval rating went up to Soviet level 96%. Right? 96%. But after that, things started emerging that people didn't really like so much. And again, polled again in 2017, it had fallen to 71%. And when we announced these results, we'd be in a setting like this, and we'd invite people from the ruling party and others to comment on these results. So the second time round, they were not so happy about what we were saying. Things got a little bit worse. First of all, in 2016, he had banned political rallies, said, we've done the elections, no need for more politicking, everybody now needs to get to work. His slogan was, it's just work from now on. Hapa kazi tu. Just work from now on. No more politicking. So people are clearly not feeling very good about this. And people started also disappearing, and unfortunately, were being found dead in rivers and floating in the ocean. So things were not looking good at all. So we polled in 2018, July 4th, I remember. We polled and announced on July 4th that his approval rating had gone down to 55%, below the share of the votes that he'd got. Now that's when things got a little bit more interesting for me. I announced that result and was able to travel to the Georgia OGP summit, actually, at that time. While I was there, I get a call from my office saying, the immigration officials are here to see you. I said, but you know, I'm not in the country. I said, well, when you come back, they would like to see you. So I went, and when I got back from Georgia, you know, in trepidation, and they said, oh, bring your passport. So I took a photocopy of my passport. But essentially, they seized my passport ostensibly to say that we're investigating your citizenship and this is a routine activity. But I said, but what is it that has caused this? You know, oh, no, routine. You know, even bishops and judges have their passports taken temporarily for us to verify their citizenship. So we tried to push back and fight back, but you know, I couldn't travel. I had my passport taken, but that was on a small personal inconvenience. What they also did was change the Statistics Act. Because we could publish statistics independent of government approval or not, they decided that they were going to change the Statistics Act and put in two clauses which would not allow you to collect independent statistics nor publish them without the permission of the National Bureau of Statistics. Nobody could do this. So I said, oh, this is going to really shut us down and shut us up. But there are other people, there are other players in this country whose credibility is contingent on them being able to produce independent statistics. And those were the World Bank and the IMF. So I went to Notre and said, you guys might have diplomatic immunity as external diplomats in this country, but your staff, if you publish anything there that the government has not put their stamp of approval, your local staff could be arrested. They said, oh, really? I said, yeah. So why don't we work together to overturn this particular rule, this particular law? And we worked really hard. The law was passed September 24th, 2018. We worked hard. We lobbied the World Bank. And then I think they decided they'd get on board. Not very often that the World Bank sides with civil society organizations, I have to say. But they sided with us. And 9 months later, June 30th, 2019, those two offending clauses were removed from the Statistics Act. I was also very happy, but another law was being passed on exactly the same day. And that was the law that Michael mentioned about, the law constraining your ability to organize as civil society organizations. So it was a very bittersweet victory, because from then on, Twaweza, which had been registered under the Companies Act, and under the Companies Act, to close you down, you had to go through the court system. They made a law which said any organization which is not explicitly promoting trade, commerce, or investment is an NGO under the NGO Act. So all of us had to re-register, and we were given 6 weeks in which to do it. I was sure that was a moment of existential crisis, that we were going to be shut down, but I had some very smart lawyers, and we were able to register the organization. But the power of the executive to manage and organize civil society remains there. Although they haven't said you cannot accept foreign money, we have to declare how much we've received. If it's more than, I think it's about $10,000 of funding, you have to share your contract, your funding contract with them. How did I get back? You know, just to give you a sense of sometimes pushing back, like we did with the World Bank and IMF and succeeded. How did I get my passport back? Well, I was advised by many well-meaning people inside government that I should just apologize to the president. And I said, but tell me what's the crime that has been committed here? What is it that we've said or done that is not correct? Well, you know, he likes to be flattered. He likes people to appreciate him. And what you're showing is not very appreciative of his efforts. at making Tanzania great again, right? I kid you not, we had a slogan, make Tanzania great again. Yeah, and we were busted that particular bubble, so apologize. I said, well, it's a bit hard to apologize when I have not committed a crime. So others said, sue them then. And so that is the completely unreasonable thing that I did. Hired a lawyer and sued the immigration officers and the attorney general. And we have a multiple tier court system. It went to the High Court, which is just below the Supreme Court. They put as the judge the president's son-in-law. So we put our case before him. He dismissed it, threw it out, and gave government carte blanche to withhold passports and do all sorts of other unconstitutional things. So we appealed to the Court of Appeal. And this is where I want to stress this, what Scott mentioned. Scott, you're there, I think. Always contest every space, he said yesterday, and it is absolutely true. We contested this decision in the courts, and in the Court of Appeal, we won. The government was ordered to return my passport after concluding the investigation. They were given 60 days to conclude the investigation. The order to return my passport. On day 61, I took the 50-page court order, went to the immigration officer who had taken my passport and showed it to him without any protest. He opened his cupboard and gave me back my passport, without any protest. So this is just my own personal story. There's lots more going on in there about how we were able to again, work with the World Bank and religious communities to try and push back against the Repressive Political Parties Act, the NGO Act, trusteeship, all of these things which allow civil society to be vibrant in a country. But maybe I leave that to you, for questions. But the final thing is this. Does voice matter? Yes. So the late president passed away in February 2021. But we continued doing our public polling, after he passed away. And in 2021, yes, the new regime passed a pretty regressive fiscal measure, charging everybody a pretty high percentage of mobile money transactions. In East Africa, everybody lives on mobile money transactions. Yeah. But very high, very aggressive. So we asked the citizens, again, using services of energy, what do you think of this? And they said, it's too high, but we'd also like to know where the money is being put to use. So the citizens, are reasonable, Tell them how you're going to use the money. But it was still too high. It generated a lot of debate. The government tried to defend that particular tax, but found that they couldn't. And within 8 weeks of us publishing that poll in 2022, which they tried to stop, by the way, by sending the special branch to a venue such as this to try and stop us. But within 8 weeks, because of that public debate, because of citizen agency, they actually removed that particular tax. So my proudest moment every day is when I try to do mobile money transaction and it says levy 0. I always remember then the power of civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, Aidan, and thank you for the unforgiving way in which you have continued to do your work in your region and in the world. I mean, that is how civil society work goes. I mean, sometimes you have ups, most of the times you have downs, but you keep fighting because you believe that you have a right to be involved in the decisions that affect you, and you have a voice. And freedom of assembly, freedom of association, and freedom of speech, as Michael told us, are some of the essential freedoms that governments encroach on when you are trying to get rid of civil society that is annoying. But we can all agree that in the case of Aidan, insurgent is the term that fits well. So over to you, Eva. You will also talk about the ups and downs of civil society and what it means to have people power.
Yeah. I will start where Michael ended, saying that in Poland we had this situation when civil society and the political parties managed to overturn this autocratic turn twice, 2007 and then 2023. And here I will make a reservation. I don't believe that it was done in alliance. 2007 and 2023, that's true. The twice there were huge pro-turnout campaigns that changed the results of election. 2007, it was run by the coalition of organizations and funded by the Batory Foundation. We were a part of it. And it ran under the slogan, under the motto, go to the polls, change the country. In 2023, there was not one pro-turnout campaign, but at least 30 of which I am aware, and probably there were more of which I am not aware. And they were not orchestrated, they were not coordinated at all, but they were somehow synchronized and they were seeing one another. All of them were targeting their particular groups, focusing mainly on those who are underrepresented at the polls. Women, especially young women, age 18, 29 and 29, 35. These two cohorts were very well kind of identified and targeted, and the youth. And these two cohorts, they changed the results of elections. You are aware of probably a lot of what is going on in the street protests, because we are living in an age that what really rules people's imagination are pictures. And these are the two pictures that I'm showing you. The pictures, probably I didn't know, sorry, I was not a part of the conversation, probably repeating one of them. That is one of the 100 Ropes March, and another one, the manifestation in front of the presidential palace in defense of the independence of the judiciary. So I wanted to tell you the story, how it came that we managed to win people, civil society managed to win this battle against autocratic regime or illiberal democracy and enter the path of return to liberal, constitutional, I would call it, democracy. It was not 1 year before the elections. It was not 3 months before the elections. It was 8 years of fight of civil society. And it started with not even the attack on the Constitutional Tribunal, but earlier there were a lot of things that were invisible to the people outside. But the attack was simultaneously at many different groups. Civil society organizations were attacked on the public media that were being taken over by the Law and Justice Party. The first that were attacked, there are organizations that were working with refugees and migrants. And even before the Law and Justice Party took power, during their electoral campaign, they were attacked, migrants and refugees, and made them a scapegoat. As somebody in our, Mr. Barroso said, that's what the autocratic regime do, they find the scapegoat. And it was really very pathetic to see how much and how fast people's attitudes changed towards the issue of migration and refugees. Poland, that has the experience of migration and its blood since, epoch of Romanticism in 18th century through the 68, when after the communist anti-Semitic purge, a lot of Polish Jews left Poland. And then 1981, when the martial law was introduced and solidarity, trade union and movement crashed, we had this, we were migrants, we were political immigrants, and we were opening our hearts to the migrants unless the propaganda of 2007 started, 2015 started. During this electoral campaign, the public opinion polls showed that from the acceptance of the refugees from Syria and other countries, and the feeling of acceptance, and that was high. 76% of people were willing to accept the refugees. After 2 weeks of the campaign, the level of acceptance fell to 23%. So the fight started, as I said, even earlier, but this attack on Constitutional Tribunal was the moment of huge mobilization of the civil society. The moment when the Committee of Defense of Democracy was established. And if those who know Polish history a little better will know, and I think Michael, I'm sure knows, that it was a direct reference to the Committee of Defense of Workers of 1978, 1976, 1979, where the democratic anti-communist opposition was defending the workers who were striking against their deterioration of their level of living and were being beaten by the militia. At that time it was not called police, of the communist police, because of that they demanded their right to strike and their right to protest. So there was a direct reference to this committee saying, now we have to defend democracy, as these people from 1970s who then were very instrumental in launching solidarity movement and democratic transformation, how they defended the rights of the workers. With this moment, there were no politicians involved. I mean, I could say that the first term of the Law and Justice Party was the term when the politicians who were in power before, they couldn't believe that they lost it. They were totally at the loss with this new situation. They didn't know how to behave. The only kind of narrative that there was there that, Law and Justice Party is bad, but no kind of possibility to work together, to come with some new proposals and agenda to resist what was happening. And it was really civil society that was making them, urging them to resist as long as possible, to delay, obstruct, prevent the destruction of democratic institutions. You could see a lot of pictures that were showing it was like 3 years of fight, because they were introducing new laws. The law on Constitutional Tribunal was changed 6 times. Then there was a law on Supreme Court, the law on Common Courts, the law on the National Council of Judiciary. And you had all the time, you had, hundreds of people in front of the parliament, in front of the Supreme Court, in front of the presidential palace, protesting and urging the politicians to resist, to really make it as long as possible not passed. So the important thing was the demonstrations and manifestation, because what they did, they raised the morale of people. They showed that you can protest, that it's not that everybody is supporting the current government, because that's how they're presenting themselves. They're saying they are the emanation of the sovereign. They are the sovereign, and they are above all other branches of power, because they speak on behalf of the sovereign. So the sovereign was divided. The sovereign was there protesting against what they were doing. So this was very important. But the second thing which was important, it was something that was not visible, but equally important, is we were using, as civil society organizations, we were using all available tools and instruments and frameworks to delay this process or prevent this process. The problem was that everything was, as I said, started at once. They were very well prepared. And this is also a story about preparedness. You have to be prepared and you have to believe what they are saying. Law and Justice Party was quite outspoken what they are going to do when they take power. They were holding these conferences, what they call the Congress, the Congress for Poland, and then they were holding their own party conference in which they lay out their program. So the moment when it was obvious that they are coming to power, because the public opinion polls were showing that they are going to win, and then we take to power, they got it. We arranged civil society organizations meeting of human rights and watchdog and rule of organizations. And we went through this program one by one. So what's going to happen? And then we said, there are so few of us and we have so small resources. We have to divide the job. We have to split the task. We cannot duplicate what one is doing. We have to say who is going to take care of this element, who is going to take care of that element. But we have to use all possible means to stop this process, to prevent this process, or to delay the process, or to make it not that harsh it could be. And the first kind of attack that happened was because of the protest, was on the law on assemblies. The Law and Justice Party wanted to limit the law on assemblies so that there will be no possibility for organizations to fight. So we were using possibility at that time. The law was not made as it's soon after in a kind of overnight tempo. Participating in the parliamentary commissions and presenting our opinion, appealing to the international institutions, and first of all, and this was very important for Poland and other countries in the European Union, the European framework. We were appealing to the Venice Commission, to the European Court of Justice, to the European Commission, presenting and documenting the violation of the rule of law, of human rights, and appealing for triggering the Article 7. And December 17, this was the moment when, for the first time in the history of European Union, Article 7, that we are the lawyers, so academics, I don't have to tell you what it means, was launched, and this was a kind of nuclear weapon, but the one that was so important and used then several times because it linked the finances, the money that Poland is receiving as a member of the EU, with the rule of law and human rights observance. The second time it was used was the moment when LGBT community was being attacked, and when 100 municipalities in Poland adopted a law of so-called free LGBT zones. The law that was saying that no LGBT ideology can take place in any of our public institutions, being taught at school. And what they mean by LGBT ideology, it was meaning that there will be no equality of rights, that the people who are of different sex orientations will be harassed and silenced. And again, this European Commission introduced this conditionality, saying wherever in which municipality this kind of law was adopted, it will not get EU structural funds and EU cohesion funds. So it was really very important element of pressing and pushing the government and making it accountable. So this accountability element was not only a part of civil society organizations that were documenting, manifesting, intervening, and also using all legal measures to stop the destruction of democracy, but also this international framework, which was extremely important. And I will stop here because I understand that I across my time.
Thank you very much, Eva. And you address a question that often has been coming up lately, which is how useful and how impactful are actually protests. And for those of us who have been in these trenches for a long time, I mean, we know that protest on its own is rarely enough to bring the changes that we want to see. It is the most evident and the easiest way for all of us to play our role, for all of you, to play a role in moments when governments become more than what they should be. But it is not enough. It needs strategy behind it, it needs tactics behind it, and it needs to be able to use and pull in the different resources and tools that we have in order to really bring about the change that we want. So over to you, Anne, with that note.
All right. I am grateful for these insights from my colleagues, and I'd like to add my thoughts as a sociologist who studies social movements and political communication. My work has focused on youth activist networks in Brazil during the period of democratic reconstruction in the 1980s and 90s, And I've also written about Brazil's 2013 protests and about the global protest wave that followed the 2008 financial crisis. So I want to make 3 points. First, that autocrats are flipping the civil resistance script through a kind of political jiu-jitsu that turns the ideals of civil society against itself. Second, that anti-partisanship in the recent protest wave has contributed to democratic backsliding. And 3, that difficult coalitions will be needed as part of a full field approach to defending democracy, which I think is very much complements the talks that we've had here. So many of you are familiar with the important work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan on the role of nonviolent civil resistance in toppling dictatorships around the world. They provided evidence that nonviolent movements are historically twice as likely as violent ones to succeed in regime change. They argue that this is due to their advantage in attracting large numbers of people, in provoking repression backfire, and in peeling away the pillars of support from the regime. So recently, Chenoweth has offered a somewhat mixed diagnosis of the ability of contemporary nonviolent movements to respond to democratic backsliding. On the positive side, she's written in a recent op-ed with Jeremy Pressman and Zoha Haman that the resistance in the US, for example, is alive and well, with many and frequent protests around the US on a wide variety of issues. She notes that given the current political situation, protesters may need to take what they call a more muscular approach with more diversified tactics and creative forms of political and economic non-cooperation. So on the more negative side, Chenoweth and colleagues have also recently argued that things have gotten more difficult for nonviolent pro-democracy protesters worldwide. Recent protests have been less successful than those in the past, as autocrats have learned the mechanisms that contribute to successful resistance and develop specific strategies to counter them. So these include tactics for consolidating the autocratic alliance, such as preventing security force defections, controlling the information ecosystem, using selective repression, like accusing certain people of being terrorists or of treason, and of leveraging identity-based politics to divide and rule. So I want to extend this analysis by noting that autocratizing regimes have been adept in a kind of political jiu-jitsu. So some of you may recognize this term from Gene Sharp, who argues that nonviolent protesters can gain advantage through moves that use the force of their opponent against them. Movements can use the aggression of oppressive regimes to shame them, to increase public resistance, to divide regime supporters, and strip away their legitimacy. So I would argue that many autocrats are engaging in kinds of reverse jiu-jitsu moves, using the aspirational ideals and normative principles of civil society, against us. So many civil society actors, which include NGOs, humanitarian and advocacy groups, universities, media, social movements, these are the carriers of this broad liberal consensus about the kind of society that we hope to live in. This was given global articulation in the Sustainable Development Goals and in international and human rights frameworks. We care about inclusion, violence, racism, or exclusion, intolerance, violence, racism, anti-Semitism, discrimination, and dehumanization of all sorts. We want to create more inclusive, just, and dialogic communities. We want to generate evidence-based research that contributes to human dignity and flourishing. And we aspire to global engagement and partnerships in research and practice. So we don't always live up to these ideals, and we wrangle about them regularly, but these are the aspirational horizons and the underpinnings of a global infrastructure of research, development, and humanitarian funding in which many people in this room are involved. So the jiu-jitsu move is to take these ideals, our strengths, and use them to shame and divide us, driving wedges among civil society sectors and instilling doubt and paralysis. It does this through these manufactured assertions and dilemmas. DEI is racist. I don't want to be racist. Humanitarian aid and the defense of human rights means supporting terrorism or foreign interference. Or support for global partnerships and institutions is wasteful, damaging to national security, and criminally suspect. So this tactic further undermines our credibility with broader publics who see the whole global intervention infrastructure as a project of disconnected and privileged elites. And these symbolic moves come with real material leverage. Civil society groups often want to keep their heads down to avoid cultural shaming, loss of funding, lawsuits, arrests, and physical threats. So the challenge for civil society is figuring out how to see through these moves and find ways to work together beyond the fear, uncertainty, and division that they seek to instill. So my second point has to do with citizen distrust in political institutions as expressed in the recent protest wave. So in a recent article in the American Journal of Sociology, Tomas Gold and I examine the political effects of the intense skepticism about political parties expressed in many protests around the world. People are rejecting not just the party in power. In many cases, they're rejecting political parties more generally, along with the whole political class. As they've shouted in Argentina in multiple protest waves, que se vayan todos, throw them all out. Or as the Spanish Indignados proclaimed in 2011, no parties represent me. This fierce anti-partisan sentiment has been heard in protests in Brazil, Italy, France, the UK, Greece, Iceland, Bulgaria, Ukraine, Turkey, India, and the Philippines, as well as here in the US in various versions, the Occupy and the Tea Party, kind of opposing versions of that. Sometimes anti-partisanship is expressed by neo-anarchists and radical horizontalist activists on the left. In other cases, it reflects a much broader distrust of corrupt and unresponsive institutions and frustration with political polarization. So in our article, Tomas and I trace how anti-partisan protests have contributed to disruptive political reconfigurations as politicians redirect hostility towards parties onto their partisan rivals. So we describe 4 different pathways depending on the structure of the partisan field. First, the rise of new internal factions, as in the UK and the US. Second, the formation of new parties, as in Spain or Greece. Third, the emergence of new anti-incumbent coalitions, as in Argentina or Bulgaria. And 4, the ascension of extremist populist leaders, as in Brazil, India, and the Philippines. And I can talk more about the particular analysis there. So now I studied these dynamics up close in the massive waves of protest that swept Brazil in June 2013. So just a few years later, in 2018, the previously marginal politician, Jair Bolsonaro, was able to capitalize on the heightened rejection of political parties, adopting the slogan from the 2013 protests, "My party is Brazil." In this case, strong anti-partisanship, amplified by corruption scandals and massive protest waves, contributed to Bolsonaro's surprising electoral success and to significant democratic backsliding in Brazil. So our more general cautionary point is that these widespread citizen distrust of political institutions can lead to disruptive new political configurations, including those that are deeply troubling for democracy. This means that social movements and civil society should not abandon political parties or state institutions. This might empower autocrats who are adept at weaponizing institutional distrust. So finally, I want to finish with some constructive suggestions on how to address some of these problems through a full field approach to civil society resistance involving insider-outsider coalitions that bridge social movements and institutional politics. So not all activists attempt to storm the barricades from the outside. Some work for change within powerful institutions, including governments, corporations, international organizations, and religious institutions. These insider strategies are often greeted with suspicion by more outsider activists who may fear co-optation or reject the idea of working within oppressive and power-laden systems. However, cooperation between these actors is essential if movements want to push back on executive overreach and advance human dignity and justice. Insider-outsider coalitions combine the disruptive impact of protests in the streets, the insurgent civil society, with more pragmatic attempts to reshape states and non-state institutions. These coalitions can be difficult and uncomfortable, walking an uneasy line between cooperation and challenge. And yet, they can be important means by which the demands of civil society and social movements become institutionalized and sustained over time. And there are important examples of this in the women's movement, research on the women's movement, environmental movements, and I think we're going to hear a whole panel on this in the next round. So just to close, these kinds of coalitions are hard. Civil society and social movement actors often disagree, not just on goals, but on styles and tactics. We've heard about insurgent versus firewall civil society, the tensions between liberals and populists. But in the face of growing democratic threats, we need this kind of full field approach to civil resistance. We need activism both inside and outside the state. We need legal mobilization, humanitarian advocacy, and also disruptive mass mobilization and political and economic non-cooperation. I would say that we also need those pressing for more utopian possibilities, reminding us that the politics of now is not the only way, and opening up challenging visions of alternative forms of social organization. So the challenge is not to be purist about the one right way for civil society to defend democracy. Cooperation will be messy and uneven, but we need to seek it out nonetheless. As scholars and practitioners, I hope we can explore new division-spanning strategies to turn our democratic ideals back into strengths on the ground.
Thank you very much, Anne. And there is just no other way to think about fighting back against the overreach of government and then working on all possible fronts and exploring all possible collaborations in order to pry open the spaces that are closing. In 2023, the Guatemalan people elected President Arevalo as the change that they wanted to see after 8 years of very repressive governments that put to play all the different strategies that can be used to restrict civic space, to criminalize, to defame, to demonize all kinds of players that had been working on the fight against impunity in Guatemala before that. And ultimately, the president who had been elected was able to take power because of months of sustained protest led by the indigenous communities of Guatemala and shared and accompanied by many actors of the private sector, the civil society sector, the academia, people within government who wanted to see change happening, and the international community. So it is possible, and this is a fight that we have to make happen every single time when executive powers start to overreach in democracies. Thank you very much. I absolutely failed to introduce myself when I started this panel. I am Helena. I work with the Ford Foundation, and I have the privilege of being a Notre Dame alumni. So thank you very much to the Kellogg Institute for this fantastic conference and this panel. And we will